Welcome to the QBC podcast, where we explore new paradigms in health and science that have a meaningful impact on our day to day lives. I'm your host, Meredith Oak, a curious coach and mom. I started a journey to overcome chronic fatigue and found myself in a whole new quantum universe. I believe new research shouldn't stay locked away in an ivory tower, and that wisdom can be found in many places and understood by all of us. To keep in touch with this podcast, the QBC free community, our episode guide, and all the show notes, please visit qbcpod.com, qbcpod.com. Let's get together to create the future we want to live in. My guest today wrote a book on the importance of sunlight to health called Daylight Robbery in 1988. Dr. Downing has been practicing ecological medicine ever since then, which is a systems approach to health that considers interactions between individuals and the environment and their health consequences. So, ecological medicine is a term that is widely used in the United Kingdom, not so much in North America and other parts of the world. But I think it's a beautiful way to explain natural health and a nice alternative to functional medicine, which has sort of become synonymous with supplements. Dr. Downing is president of the British Society for Ecological Medicine and was for 20 years editor of the Journal of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. He serves on the editorial board of the Orthomolecular News Service. Dr. Downing and I had a lovely conversation where I was able to learn from his decades of wisdom working in alternative health and in natural health, and as somebody who understood deeply and early the implications of our changing light environment and our changing EMF environment. So I hope you enjoy my chat with Dr. Downing. I certainly did. He is a fountain of knowledge that goes back many years. And he is working on a new book and continues to be an active practitioner in London. So if you live in that area, do look him up. He sees patients and continues to practice his wisdom to this very day. Enjoy. And before we get into it, please do consider your infrared light exposure this winter, and really any time in the summer months and in warm places. It's obviously easier to get it full body infrared light exposure when you're outside in the sunshine. However, if you're not able to be outside in the sunshine, and also to help with detox, an infrared sauna is really my top recommendation for feeling good in the winter. It's something that I added to my routine a couple of years ago when I moved back to a cold place after living in places that weren't so cold. And I really, really noticed a huge difference in how I felt getting through the winter months. I should say, enjoying and thriving through the winter months. I appreciate winter so much more now that I know how to properly take care of myself when it's cold and when we're in that time of year. And one of those things is making sure we get lots of infrared light, which you can get from light panels, and infrared saunas are especially good because you have the heat as well, which is a helpful detox. So I recommend, if you need any of those things, to visit boncharge.com, boncharge.com. They have a very nice little infrared sauna blanket that you can just cozy up under while you are, watching a movie with your blue blockers on, of course. All right. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Downing. He is a delightful British gentleman. Have fun. Bye. Dr. Damien Downing, welcome to the QBC podcast. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you work in what is called ecological medicine. Could you tell us a little bit about your long career in that field and how you define it? So it's not a word that's used as commonly in North America.
No, right. Well, it all started in about 1979. That's before I came into the field. One of the founders was Professor Ronnie Finn, who was the guy that did the definitive paper in the Lancet journal showing that food allergy was a real thing and that you could cut it out and so forth. And he and a few others including Alan Grant, who did the paper that clearly showed that migraine could be caused by food intolerances. They set up a society. I've got the notes from the agenda from the original meeting there, and there's a meeting to consider setting up a society for clinical ecology, is what they called it back then. Uh, and it's at 11 o'clock sherry. It starts, and then at 12 o'clock they start talking, something like that. So those days are gone, I think, including pretty much everybody who's there is now gone. But then in about 1983, we set up what was then called the British Society for Nutritional Medicine, and then it kind of added bits in, and allergy came in, and all sorts of other stuff came in. And eventually, all those societies ended up merging, and we called it ecological medicine, echoing what was said way back then. So ecological medicine is kind of a systems approach. It's looking at the interactions between you and the environment. And obviously, the whole sunlight factor, or what John Ott called malillumination, is a key part of that. And my God, we didn't realize back then, didn't realize nearly as much as we do now, because of all the evidence coming from photobiomodulation and so on and so forth, and our understanding of mitochondria. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's really got so exciting these days.
It really has. And it's interesting because, along with the food, our light environment has got, our food sources, food production have gone off the rails. And at the same time, the light that we're surrounded by in our environment has become worse and worse. While in parallel, the research showing how important real food and natural light are is also mounting. We
Yeah,
we seem to be in a
absolutely.
state of complete imbalance there.
Yeah.
What are your what are your thoughts on how how that happened? Because you wrote a book on the importance of sunlight to health in 1988.
Yeah.
And so as you were saying about the foundation of the ecological field of medicine, that this was scientists and doctors were aware of the importance of our environment, and yet somehow the innovation of the technology and the processing of our food just went on completely unchecked. Could you sort of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. It's always been in all of this field, it's always been more of a patient-driven progress than driven by doctors or even scientists. No, and that
Mm.
uh, the British Society of Dermatologists reviewed it and said it's a load of rubbish, basically. And the British Naturist Society, people who like to be naked in the fresh air, they reviewed it and said, oh, it's the most important medical book of the decade. So you see they're
So the
biased.
dermatologist said your sunlight book was rubbish, and the naturalist said it was brilliant. Yeah, okay, that tracks.
Right, yeah. And in America, of course, I mean, I'm not the expert on all this, but I understand the dermatologists launched a $2 million campaign in about 1982, whatever, to demonize sunlight and get everybody, looking themselves for cancers. And that kind of made dermatology quite lucrative, which it wasn't before. So there are inevitably vested interests in this sort of thing, aren't there? You're not going to get away from that. But it's interesting writing now, because I'm writing, well, I don't know if it's a sequel or whatever, but a successor to Daylight Robbery. So it's interesting to look at what happens with these trends, because in writing the sequel to Daylight Robbery, I've been struck by how long it takes for these things to actually be adopted. Somebody does the original science, I mean, Albert Einstein did the AMC squared in 1920 something, got the Nobel Prize and so forth, but it was decades before it was really applied. Shent Georgi, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm not sure anybody does, but you know the guy I mean.
Yeah.
Guy isolated vitamin C and so forth, and also wrote a lovely little book called Bioenergetics in 1957. And he said, he talked about this queer substance, water, and he said that not just water, but almost any liquid, where it's in contact with a solid surface, tends to structure from the surface outwards. So that was, what, more than 60 years ago. This was known about, and it's only just now with Gerald Pollack's work and so forth, that everybody's saying, oh my God, structured water. And it is, I mean, it's crucial, it's brilliant, but I'm surprised at how long these things take. And I don't think it's just, because people are making a profit out of it not being recognized and so on. I think it's just, well, doctors tend to think that what, they learned in medical school is it and so forth. And if they didn't learn about it, then it can't be real. And of course, they didn't learn about nutrition in medical school, and they certainly didn't learn about sunlight and its benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. I just saw a post yesterday from a woman who was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis by her MD. This was in the United States. And she said to him, okay, how should I change my diet now that I have this diagnosis? And he said to her, it doesn't matter what you eat.
Oh, God.
This was
Wow.
like a year ago.
Yeah,
So
I
she
know.
left and got a new doctor, but it just was a reminder to me that physicians are still saying that about food, never mind getting to the light piece of it.
Yeah, yeah. We used to call them, when we started up the journal in 1990, we used to call them nutritional flat earthers. People still believe the earth is flat. Nutrition isn't important. How can it not be important?
So you've had a major focus on gut health and food allergies. Could you explain to us a little bit, sort of after all of your decades working with patients and doing research and giving presentations and running the ecological journal, where are you at with explaining how food and light and digestion all or health and health overall, I would say, all work together.
Oh, well, you want the short answer to that one.
Yeah, I've got an hour, so you just go
Okay,
just
yeah.
talk as long as you want.
Right. So it's interesting. When I came into this game back in 1980, 81, um, there were people saying that, the food allergy had kind of just been invented by, there was a guy called Richard McInnes who wrote a book called Not All in the Mind. I don't know if it made it big in America.
I don't know.
But it certainly did over here. He basically showed not only uh, from practical practicing doctors' viewpoint, he showed the food allergies were real, chemical sensitivities were real. He described some lady who used to use a lot of hairspray and it gave her terrible neurological symptoms. He fixed it just by cutting it out. The interesting thing is that he wrote that in, I think, 66. 10 years earlier, he wrote a book called Eat Fat and Grow Slim, saying
Wow.
that, you needed a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And now that's become an essential part of what we and anybody in integrated medicine does. But that took a few decades as well. But back then, people used to say, "Oh, I wonder if it's the food upsetting me." And then all of a sudden, people were saying, "Oh, I've got total allergy syndrome." And we did an awful lot of desensitizing back then. And then people started getting multiple chemical sensitivity, started figuring out. And this is all, well, practically all people figuring it out for themselves, and there's not going to their doctor who's saying, oh, you've got multiple chemical sensitivity. Usually the doctor's saying, oh, there's no such thing. And diet doesn't matter. And then, of course, more recently, electrosensitivity has come into the picture. And then, it's true that the what they call it, the gateway drug to all this is just basic allergies, I don't know, inhaled allergies, hay fever, and so forth, or food intolerances. And you carry that gate being severe for long enough, you then move on to the next level and get multiple chemical sensitivity. And after a few years, you move on to the next level. But it's also, you have to be integrated out of it now, because it always has been true that toxicity is part of the problem. And it was John Ott that described that in the light context. His malillumination was a combination of not enough sunlight and too much of this thing. I was thinking about how I could do a Zoom without a screen, but since you need the video, I guess I'll have to stay here for this.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We'll keep it brief and then go for walks outside after.
All right. Yeah, right. So then now, of course, everybody's saying, oh, I think I've got MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. And I'm not even sure that that's a real disease. I think it's just a different way of looking at it, which opens a lot of possibilities. There's a list of drugs and of other treatments that may make a difference to histamine release or whatever it is that's driving your MCAS. But I mean, it's all part of the same thing. And with the toxicity, again, we should have realized to some extent, we did realize a long time ago. When I started in this, there had been one or two papers. It was kind of regarded as a given that aluminium probably had something to do with Alzheimer's. But that was 40 years ago, and we're still arguing about it now. And papers coming out saying, no, it doesn't work. Yes, it does. And so forth.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what I'm really hearing speaking with you is how, what you were just saying earlier, like how long it takes for these new ideas to get traction. And it doesn't seem to be related to how true they are. There seems to be other factors at play. So we had, John Ott decades ago talking about doing all the light research, and Georgia you mentioned, and so many other researchers. I know. Georgia.
Yeah, right.
And anyway, it's just interesting to me, right? Because we're all like, oh, this is all this new stuff, and it's like it's not new. It's just kind of hiding or being ignored or being pushed to the periphery, and it's taking all of us. We have to go looking for it, but the research is there and the evidence is there, and it's been there for a long time. And you've created you and your colleagues have created an entire field around it.
Yeah.
So walk me through that. I'm sorry, what do you do? Read me, yeah.
Yeah. First sentence of Daylight Robbery from 1988 goes, the plot of many a thriller has hinged on the fact that the best place to hide something is where it is obvious. I think that applies, absolutely in spades to the sunlight thing, You say, yes. How did we miss it? Because it was always there. we never realized that we were systematically depriving ourselves of it, even though, I mean, what's the real punishment in a prison or a dungeon? Let's be straight. It's depriving you of sunlight. That's why they talk about a prison town. Sheet white people. You see somebody like that, I think they've probably been inside. Yeah,
And, I think back to the years of my life where I was completely bought into the idea that the sun was bad for me. And
yeah,
I was a good girl and I was going to follow the rules. And I put on my SPF 9000 every time I went out in the sun.
yeah. I know.
And
That's,
I feel a little betrayed, I have to say.
yeah, yeah. What turned it for you?
The first moment was actually from a woman who did cosmetic, like she was doing stuff for my skin. I was in my
Mhm.
20s and she had been trained in Hungary. She was probably in her 60s. So 60 something Hungarian woman, and she was looking at my skin and she said, "You don't go out in the sun enough." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "The sun is life." And she said it with such force and such conviction that it actually broke through my false paradigm and stayed with me. And I didn't, it was a long time before I understood it the way I do now, but it was enough that I stopped being so crazy about putting on SPF and started to think like, oh, that actually makes sense. The sun is life. Like, you can tell something is true by how it feels when how it feels in your
Of
body. And I
course it
was
is.
like,
Yeah.
God, do you find that when you have been working with people or when people come to you and you broach this subject, are they open to it? The
These
idea of
days,
sunlight?
yes. I
Okay.
mean, way back, nobody really thought about it. But sometimes you get dramatic changes in people. But then you think we didn't have nearly as many screens back then. You were pretty advanced if you had a computer,
Yeah.
and smartphones hadn't been invented. So the situation was not as bad, really. It's got a lot worse over the
Yeah.
decades. Firstly, because we're even more out of natural light and in toxic light, if you like. We're malilluminated more and more. Secondly, because other forms of toxicity are just getting worse and worse all the time,
Right.
you know. Now, there's a principle that I keep thinking about. I'm not sure to what extent it works. The principle is that natural light, good light, will protect you from the effects of bad light. Now, there are a few instances where it clearly is true, but the good light, you have to have the good light exposure first, and that may be near infrared or whatever. But the extent to which you can then fix the damage of bad light and so forth by good light, I'm not sure. Yeah, well, we're not sure, but I mean, it is obviously it's the fabric of the universe that we're dealing with here. This whole, especially once you bring structured water in, there's the smallest things, electrons, photons, protons, and so forth. And it's suddenly you start to realize, my God, it's on our side. Actually, it always was on our side. There's a paper I've just been looking at that somebody linked me to by some Korean guys about magnetic sense. You know that birds navigate by magnetic sense and so forth, and some of it happens in the eyes, and other bits of it happen with magnetic granules or whatever somewhere in the brain. And it turns out that humans can do this to a certain extent, but it's only men, really, and it's only by this method anyway. and it's only slightly over 50% of them, but that could be just because all the rubbish EMFs that we're exposed to. So it's only men, it's only when they're hungry, and it's only when they're exposed to blue light. So if you're a hunter-gatherer and you wake up hungry, well, obviously this is a real advantage, isn't it? You know, you're
And this is
magnetic.
the ability to navigate by the
Yeah,
magnetic field.
to know where true north is, or which is a reasonable marker for
Fascinating.
navigating by. Amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah. But so it's the principle that this is the environment we're involved in, where there is blue light in the mornings and there is a magnetic field that we can navigate by.
When you talk about the fabric of the universe, how do you how do you think about that and where we fit into it and where our mitochondria and our cells and our bodies
Well,
fit into it?
yeah. Mitochondria, wherever they came from. You know that melatonin is basically as old as mitochondria.
Mm. We did not.
Yeah, and it's the probably the best antioxidant going. I'm not sure that it makes much sense to have a league table of antioxidants, but it's a powerful antioxidant, and it's probably, they say, about 5 times as potent an antioxidant as vitamin C.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know how they figured that out. That is what is said. It's that it is produced in the night by the pineal gland. And the pineal, we used to think it going around the bloodstream, you could measure the melatonin there, and it was on its way to the brain. No, the pineal pumps it into the ventricles of the brain, which circulate it through about the glymphatic system?
Tell us.
Okay. The brain doesn't have an ordinary lymphatic drainage like the rest of the body. The rest of the body has lymphatic ducts that run away from the tissues and take the things to the regional lymph glands, the ones in your neck here, the ones in your armpit, and so forth. And what they're taking there is firstly waste and secondly information. And that's the same stuff, because the immune system needs to know what it's going to have to handle. And that's how it gets that information, and that's how it activates the lymphocytes and so forth to do it. But we always thought that there wasn't a system like that in the brain, or there was just a tiny bit of it and so forth. Turns out the brain has a better system. It's got what you would call a paravascular system, so that there are spaces around the vessels that are to some extent driven by the pulsing in the vessels, and they carry a load of other stuff that isn't in the blood. For instance, in the brain, the other thing about the brain is that that's got an inward and an outward direction of travel for this glymphatic or paravascular system, right? The inward takes the stuff from the ventricle into the tissue of the brain, and the outward one takes it from the tissue of the brain and the interstitium, if you like, of the brain out and connects to the lymphatics around the back here, and more particularly through the nose.
Okay.
And the structures around here. And so another interesting fact about that is that when you suck and chew and adjust the pressure in your mouth, there's a certain amount of pumping action going on this stuff coming from the brain. Why do comforters work on children? Probably for that reason. It calms the brain physically and literally by helping the
Like
brain.
a soother, you mean like a
Yeah,
pacifier
yeah,
when the
yeah,
baby,
exactly.
that
Yeah,
sucking motion. Oh, okay. That
correct. Yeah.
makes sense.
And the melatonin is produced by the pineal, goes straight into the ventricles, and from that it goes by the paravascular route into the brain, timed to happen when the glymphatic system is activated, which is when you are asleep, and particularly in deep sleep. So it goes in there and all the helps to mop up all the antioxidant, all the oxidative stress and toxins. And also it activates some of the other molecules like superoxide dismutase and so on. And then all the gumph is taken out and delivered to actually to the lymph nodes around here in due course, including the ones in here, the tonsils. So all this stuff is so in the brain. But that's one half of the story. Because, and again, it happened a long time ago. 1972, there was a paper where they took the pineal gland out of little furry animals, rats or whatever, and measured their circulating melatonin. And it obviously went down, but only by about 80%. So there must have been melatonin coming from elsewhere. And where it's coming from is every cell in the body, and particularly the mitochondria of every cell, because that's where it's needed. Because when you produce energy, the electron, I think, I'm not quite sure who said it, but I will find out eventually. The electron transport chain, the cytochromes in the mitochondrial wall, is less than perfect. So every few thousand times or whatever, it drops a free radical there instead of using it constructively. And so when you exercise, when you produce ATP, you build up oxidative stress, and you also produce the melatonin to deal with it. You produce it locally, and not much of it gets out. So it's hard to know quite what circulating levels of melatonin mean. Sorry, it's hard to know what they mean because it's the overflow. It's not like it's being delivered somewhere. It's the stuff that's spilled over from the mitochondria and during the night from the brain.
So the melatonin has spilled over from where it's produced and then is used by the rest of the body for all kinds of important things.
Presumably, yes. But I mean, if you get a paper, there is a paper, for instance, that says you can get a boost to your circulating melatonin level from eating 2 bananas. Now, I'm sure it's true, but what does it mean in real life? Because if it's there circulating, it's not necessarily getting into the mitochondria, which is where it's really needed.
So what is the best way to ensure sufficient melatonin production?
Good circadian rhythm with decent sleep at night for a reasonable period, and probably either to use Andrew Huberman's thing about getting outside in the first hour of waking, get outside for 5 minutes and look up at the blue sky and so forth. Well, I tell you, it doesn't work here, but it's miserable and cold out there and it's dark. Yeah, that's a good principle. And better still, do some exercise. Because exercise causes you a high spike in circulating melatonin, so it must be causing even bigger a spike in the melatonin where it's needed in the mitochondria, presumably in your muscles. So I think those are really kind of the two elements of the circadian rhythm that you first need, most important.
Morning sunlight and morning movement.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
night sleep.
And sleeping well at night, right. With ideally not a lot of artificial light exposure before bed
Yeah,
or
correct.
while you're sleeping.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, I mean it's how much is enough to disrupt? Not much, really. There is a study. I should, if you gave me a couple of minutes, I could probably find, but we talked about it back then with daylight robbery. Showed that using a single blue light bulb, which is not very bright at all, an incandescent bulb, by the bed, and having it on and off in a cycle would entrain women's menstrual cycles.
Hmm.
You know? So that's an effect coming from really not much extra light of that color coming in.
But it's
Um,
still enough to completely change
yeah,
our hormone cycle.
yeah,
Yeah, so we really need to be mindful of this because most people, I mean, where I live, most people have, you know, it gets dark outside, they flip on the overhead LEDs, the
yeah,
whitest, brightest light. They probably have that light bulb next to their bed to read before they go to sleep if they're not reading on their phone or their iPad. And it's just
yeah,
considered normal. Nobody even thinks about it.
yeah. No, no, that's right. It's well, it's in plain sight, so we're missing it,
Right.
aren't we?
So, what prompted you to write Daylight Robbery? What was going on that led you to write an entire book on the health benefits of sunlight? What were you seeing? What was happening in the world? How did that happen?
Well, really, it was meeting John Ott. I mean, obviously, I was already doing uh, nutrition and things like that. I came into this stuff really originally by training in acupuncture. But then when I started up practicing it, set up a clinic, a couple of people came to me and said, "Oh, I think I might have a food allergy. Have you read this book by Richard McCarnes?" And so I started doing, more and more of that. And then I read something about John Art, and so I got interested in that as an extension of the whole nutrition thing. And went over to see John Art, and he was a lovely guy living in Florida. And he showed me his special glass in his windows and the way he'd adapted his TV so that it lay on the floor in a box pointing upwards. Then he had a mirror at this angle above it so that it came out there. But hopefully the harmful rays were going straight up out the ceiling.
Oh my goodness, I've never heard that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he invented his own kind
Defense
of
against that. Yeah,
mitigation technology.
yeah,
So these things are possible. We don't have to be. I mean, if he could just do
no,
that in his living room, I'm sure all
yeah,
these brilliant engineers could figure this out if they wanted to.
yeah, yeah. That's right. And
Okay.
I've got a colleague who's quite influential in the whole electro, well, not just electrosensitivity, but harm from electromagnetic fields and
Hmm.
so forth. And I mean, you understand that we have, we now have billion in certain frequencies, there are a billion times as much electromagnetic fields waves about now as there were 50 years ago. And of course, it's harmful. One of the people who's quite influential in that has the problem herself and has been shown in a blinded experiment to react to mobile phone
Yeah.
things and so forth. But she manages to use a computer and so forth, just has them solid wired. And if
Right.
necessary, insulate stuff, and you can get a bit of tin foil and put it around the connectors or whatever. It's better than putting it around your food.
Yes, that's true. So we buy the tinfoil, but we use it to wrap our
Yeah,
wires, not our
yeah,
food.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
This is yeah, we're definitely not not looking like the basic normies out there anymore. Okay. So you were
yeah.
talking about meeting John
So,
Ott,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
that led to writing Daylight Robbery.
Yeah, well, I led to doing a bit more research and so forth. And I mean, it wasn't just going on the internet those days, I'll have you know. You know, you
It's true.
had to write off to the British Library, fill these little forms in for the paper, and a couple of weeks later they sent it to you. I've still got a few of those hanging around. But you know, things emerged like the cancer connection with lack of sunlight. The basic principle is that, well, not the principle, the rule of thumb, if you like, is that the further north or south from the equator you go, the more cancer there is, the greater your chances of developing cancer. And the figure we kind of comes out with is 2.5 times. If you live in, I don't know, Oslo or somewhere way up north, or possibly Edmonton even, uh, you've got around 2.5 times the probability of developing cancer as you have in let's say in Florida.
Hmm.
That paper goes back to like the 20s. You know, so some of this is 100 years old now, and of course that's got worse because of a whole bunch of things like the actual ionizing radiation. What we haven't really appreciated is that, firstly, um, an event like Chernobyl or Fukushima, which is still going on, right? Firstly, they're not the 100 years events. The Chernobyl was a succession of the latest in a succession of events, and there have been several since. Nuclear, if you've got all this nuclear stuff, you know, it's going to go wrong sometimes, inevitably, and it does. The second principle is that that radiation doesn't just stay there where it is, it goes all around the world. So we're all exposed to a greater background level of radiation than we were. And with Chernobyl, there's the amazing story of the Pripyat marshes, which are all around the exclusion zone in around the reactor in Chernobyl. And every year, a couple of times a year, different berries. The locals go into the marshes and they into the woods there and gather up berries, two different times of berries at different times a year. And then they bring them out to the roads, and there are merchants there with stalls on the roads, and they weigh the berries and so forth, and they run a Geiger counter over them. If the Geiger counter sounds off high, they still buy the stuff. They just pay the guys less. And then it goes into into the international system. It could be in your jam at breakfast right now, really.
The radiated berries.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So we have the background of the really bad ionizing radiation, and then we also have the non-ionizing radiation that we surround ourselves by with
Yeah.
our mobile phones, our Wi-Fi, cell towers,
Yeah.
5G, all of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. All of this. That just keeps getting worse all the time.
Have you noticed, well, I mean, you talked about the electrosensitivity. Have you noticed in your patients symptoms becoming more complex and symptoms arising in younger people. I know here in the United States, there's an epidemic of combination of autoimmune and mood disorders and all kinds of things happening in very young people,
Yeah,
adolescents, teenagers, and often even children, young
yeah,
children.
that I mean that has been going on for a long time, still is going on, and it's not as well. There's one interesting surprise that we just noticed, but generally, it's been kind of predicted for a long time that things are going to go on getting worse like that. And a colleague of mine, Stephen Davis, described what he called the nutrient-toxin interface. Quite simply, the more toxins you're exposed to, and let's include toxic stress in this and AMFs and everything else. The more toxins you're exposed to, the more nutrients you need to deal with them. Simple as that. So why would we not take supplements these days? The one interesting one that I just realized I'd experienced is I was talking about kids with this strep reaction called pandas,
Hmm.
which is an autoimmune disease triggered by strep infection. And I realized that both of them had had shingles in childhood. So shingles is a reaction to or it's a reactivation of the chickenpox virus.
Right.
But that's only supposed to happen decades later than you
Yeah,
had
I
them.
always thought shingles, you got chicken pox. I mean, this was back before they vaccinated the crap out of everyone, but
Yeah.
you got chicken pox as a child and shingles as an adult if you were unlucky enough not to have the chicken pox as a child or if it came back. And the shingles were way worse.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And could
Yeah.
leave lasting
So you're
consequences.
saying there now children were having shingles.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's a new
New
development.
to new to everybody, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is just another symptom of
Well, yeah,
our immune
this
systems
this
being
isn't
destroyed.
anything. Yeah, I guess so. By all sorts of factors together, including the malillumination and the crap in the food and so forth. It isn't just to do with the COVID vaccine or anything like that. Because these two predated, both of them
Yes.
predated that. So
Yeah,
I
well, it's interesting when you're saying, we need to have a nutrient load, the nutrient load needs to be greater than the toxic load, or the restorative inputs need to be greater than the assault inputs. And decade by decade, we've been adding
increasing
assault
the
over
toxins. Yeah,
assault over assault. Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
and with the light piece, I think not even understanding. I think the food piece we kind of knew, we just didn't do anything about it. But
yeah, quite.
with the light piece, it's like, people are sort of still surprised. What are you talking about? What do you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm curious, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the glymphatic system in the brain, you mentioned the tonsils. And I want to ask you something. I have met two children. I live in the northeast of the United States, and I have met two children in the last year whose pediatricians recommended they have their tonsils removed.
Mm.
And they did. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. It was my understanding that that's not necessarily something that is recommended these days, but I was surprised. I mean, to personally know two people.
Yeah.
Should
I,
we, as parents, be cautious about that procedure?
I think you should, yes. I mean, it is true that you do get kids who have recurrent tonsillitis and so they're sick, they're off school, their learning suffers and that kind of thing. They're unwell a lot of the time. But I mean, what's our response to that? We give them loads of antibiotics, which trashes their microbiome for pretty much the rest of their life. And then we vaccinate them. And there's good evidence that having things like measles infection, I mean, gives you some defense against allergies and that kind of thing. So that's part of the story of the explosion of the epidemic of allergies, whatever that we're seeing. And I mean, allergies, autoimmunity is just like the armed wing of allergy, really. And in fact, now that we understand more about autoimmunity, we realize that these are just mistakes in a language that our immune system is speaking all the time. 70% of the immune system is involved in not reacting to things. Only 30% is involved in reacting. And so you need a balance of all of these things. You need the activators and the regulators. And it's the same for allergies, autoimmunity, and for cancer. They're all to do with imbalance, disruption of the immune system. And having a good circadian rhythm is obviously a key factor in all of that. So, I mean, these days, you ask me, well, what's the first thing I should do about all of that? Get a good circadian rhythm.
Yeah, it's comforting to hear you say that because I think the bad news is so many people have terrible light inputs and don't think about it. But the good news is it's not that complicated to fix.
No, no.
It's just changing a few light bulbs, putting some filters on your screen, that there are ways to going
Yeah,
outside. It's
yeah,
not hard stuff.
no. And I don't really, it's another, this is things like the, auditing your environment for electromagnetic fields and so forth. There isn't an absolute threshold that you've got to get over for this to do you any good. I mean, every move in the right direction is going to be beneficial to you.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, when I started thinking about the screen stuff, um, I started getting floaters in the eye,
Mm.
and I went to the big eye hospital here, Moorfield, and they say, yeah, well, it's floaters. They might go away, might not, may come back again. So I said, what can I do about it? Nothing really. They've got no treatments for it, but I fixed it. I reckon, with two things. One is hydration, and particularly, zeta-based hydration.
What do you
Uh,
mean by that?
oh, okay. Um, the zeta potential is the charge on cells and other surfaces. So, opposite poles attract, positive and negative attract to each other, like poles repel. So the zeta potential is the negative potential on the surface of red blood cells, most obviously, that keeps them apart, keeps them separated. If you do dark field microscopy on somebody ill, I don't, but the first thing they always say is, oh, look, your red cells are clumping. That's why they're clumping, is because they haven't got enough negative charge to keep them apart. And so because they're actually larger than some of the capillaries they have to go down, they have to be apart. If they're clumped, it's deadly. You're not going to get nearly enough blood, oxygen, all the other nutrients to your tissues. So zeta potential is I think one of the most fundamental things you can do. And of course, it's coming from the structured water.
The zeta potential is coming from the structured water.
Yeah.
So when you say hydrating yourself, zeta hydration, is that a particular type of water or?
Well, it's pure water. really. I mean, I certainly wouldn't use London tap water. I don't know about where you are, you
No,
know.
there's fluoride.
Right. Oh God, no, that's awful. That's really bad. I've got a great big filter under my sink, kitchen sink, whatever it's there,
Okay.
and it's got a vortexer, a swirler or
Okay.
whatever. So that's, but
So
then you just need to add ordinary
pure
type
vortexed
electrolytes.
water.
Yeah.
And then
And
do you add minerals? What do you do to it?
you add electrolytes. I mean, to be honest, they all work, I reckon, really. There probably are some that are distinctly better than others, but all the stuff, potassium and magnesium and so forth, that they would probably give you if you had diarrhea, but without the crap. Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, anyway. But I think they all work, you know.
Yeah.
Certainly seem to
The
work for me.
electrolyte combinations.
Yeah,
So pure water, vortex, electrolytes. Okay. So
yeah,
we were talking about how you
yeah,
cured your floaters. Okay, so that was the first piece, well hydrated with water that can keep our zeta potential in a good place.
yeah.
All
And
right.
then the other input that I did was the infrared. But actually, these days, I think it's clear that you need the UV as well as the infrared. Because the effect of these wavelengths on the structured water is infrared, particularly 8-10 nanometers, which is the best penetrating one, builds up the layers, more and more layers of the structured water. And the impact of the UV is to build up the depth of the negative charge in there. So, both together is a perfect combination.
Huh. Can you explain that a little more? I haven't heard it put quite like that. It's interesting.
Ah, okay. We assume people listening to this will know about structured water.
Yeah, more or less, yes.
Right. Okay.
But I
Well,
mean, but if you have a quick overview of that, please give it. I always like to have I learn something new from the way people explain it things
okay.
just in their own
We'll have a
special way.
go.
Yeah.
Um, Structured water, well, Schenk Georg, the unpronounceable one,
Yeah.
uh, said that this happens, 60 years ago, that lots of liquids, not just water, in contact with the surface, they form a sort of a structure. And he said water has two melting points. One when solid ice melts into water, and the second, which is in the 30s centigrade somewhere, quite near our body temperature, where the liquid ice, which is the structured water, melts. And he speculated that this gives our bodies the ability to destroy and reform structured water kind of at our will. So it was presumably is something to do with what running a temperature does. Whether it's making the environment less friendly to infecting agents or whatever, not quite sure yet. But that certainly happens. So structured water forms when it's in touch with a surface that has a bit of charge on it. And it doesn't take much. So it tends to have a kind of a hexagonal form. It's a layer. First, it's a monolayer, then it's multiple layers. And it's been calculated that inside us, because there's no empty space inside us, it's all stuff. It's all molecules. And a lot of the molecules that are at the interstitium, like the glycosaminide glycans and so forth, they really like water. And so the water on the top of those will be structured water, and also on collagen, which is it's like rope. There's long strings, small filaments and so forth. So electricity travels better through structured water because it doesn't have to try going everywhere. It's got a kind of a straight line. It's like providing it with a wire, but
Mhm.
slightly flat wire. So this is kind of key to a lot of life. This is the bit where the universe is on our side, you know. So I think, honestly, without this sort of stuff, life probably would never have happened. But it did. And presumably these rules must be the same everywhere in the universe. So, you know, maybe the SETI search for extraterrestrial intelligence will finally find something. We shall see. But the structured water happens naturally just because it's in contact with the surface. And then kind of all light, to a greater or lesser extent, encourages it to build up more and more layers of structured water. But the best at doing it is the infrared. And in fact, it's in sort of middle infrared, where you're talking thousands of nanometers. But the problem with that is that not much reaches the surface of the Earth because it's absorbed by the water in the atmosphere. So the most useful one is the near infrared, when there's a lot more reaches us, and also it seems to be the wavelength with the best penetration. So it goes, you know, way deep into us, and things like the cerebrospinal fluid are pretty good conductors of that sort of electricity. You know, when you do ultrasound examination, fluids, watery fluids, look black. There's no reflection from in there. The stuff goes straight through easily. And I think if you were to do it with light, it would be the same, certainly with the infrared light. It's carried well through cerebrospinal and, of course, through the amniotic fluid. So the baby's getting a nice dose, especially if you know, take your bump out into the sun. Baby gets a really good dose. So the infrared does that, and the ultraviolet, which we need for a variety of reasons. This is one of the reasons why it's beneficial to us, because it helps to build up the depth of the charge right next to the cell or the molecule or whatever, which keeps everything moving and flowing. So whether that is why UVA and blue light, high energy visible, if you like, make the magnetic sense work, don't know yet. You know, there's a lot to be figured out about that.
Wow. So it really, I mean, we really are getting charged up.
Yeah,
We're these little sort of liquid crystal matrices getting charged up by the light that we
yeah.
surround ourselves by, or depleted, as the case may be.
Right, yes, quite. Yeah.
Wow. So I just love hearing about this. It really, I mean, there's almost a spiritual aspect to it when you think
Yeah,
of how
I think
exquisite it all is,
it's, yeah, I agree. Yeah. We're in touch with the fundamentals of the universe. Yeah.
just by existing.
Yeah. Yeah. Is what I kind of say is it's in the nature of things. All of this stuff is in the nature of things, in the nature of the universe. It's how the universe works. If we let it, we seem to do our best to prevent it.
Oh, there's the key. There's the key, Dr. Downing, if we let it.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful way to put it, because that is all. We just need to allow it. We don't actually have to do anything except get the stuff out of the way
Yeah.
that's disallowing it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Beautiful. So tell us, before we wrap, tell us about your next book. Is it building on daylight robbery and the benefits of sunlight? What can we expect?
It is, but I mean, it's had to be completely rewritten. I couldn't just do an update. Back in like the 80s, we figured the bit about cancer. We'd figured that it was that light was good for the heart, but we didn't really understand why. But I mean, that's much better these days. We understand a lot more about lipids and about mitochondria. There were observations that athletes could improve their performance by exposing to sunlight and so forth. You know, very clear evidence back then. But we didn't really understand how that was happening. We were only speculating. Obviously, we knew about vitamin D and, you know, cancer and rickets and so on and so forth. But now that we understand about mitochondria, we understand that there's a wavelength, the 810 nanometers, that penetrates, that goes straight into the mitochondria. And there was a big argument, I guess it still goes on, saying, is what's happening there that it's cytochrome C oxidase, one of the elements of the mitochondrial electron transport chain, because that resonates at the right frequency. And then there's a bunch of people saying, no, that's silly. It's really structured water. And now we have, you know, it certainly would work by structured water. It may be that structured water is not the only thing, but it's definitely got to be part of it, you know. So all of a sudden, except, you know, there seems to be this latency period of about 50 years for all of it. We've got, oh God, it all fits together. So that's why the magnetic sense bit is that it's really, so I call this another way it all fits together.
Right. All the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. So it started out with observing the effect, like we can clearly see sunlight helps with this. And now we've gotten to the explanation of the causative mechanisms of how.
Yeah. Mind you, I'd be very careful about saying, oh, we've got all the answers now.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That is so true. We are at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning, most likely of a new paradigm of understanding. And, you know, it's thanks to people like you for working in this field and researching it and bringing it to your patients. So thank you.
Okay, it's my pleasure. My delight.
Well, I appreciate you sharing. And yeah, I would love to do this again. I think there's lots more that we could talk about. And thank you. And thank you for your to the world.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Meredith.
This has been the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. To find a practitioner who practices from this point of view, visit our directory at quantumbiologycollective.org. If you are a practitioner, definitely take a look at the Applied Quantum Biology Certification, a 6-week study of the science of the new human health paradigm and its practical application with your patients and clients. We also love to feature graduates of the program on this very podcast. Until next time, the QBC.